Hi, I'm Father Brad Mathias, and welcome you into my office here in Conway, New Hampshire. I've done a series of virtual Bible study videos over the last really 12 months since the COVID pandemic has really affected our ability to do ministry. And so this week I'm sort of stepping back into that role, virtual Bible study guy, and I just felt like that we needed a different environment than the church or some of the other places I've been recording, and I want you to see kind of where I do a lot of the heavy lifting. This is some of the books that I share with the parish. I work in a 100-year-old plus farmhouse that's been converted to a rectory, and I'm the sixth rector of this parish. So over the last 40 plus years, there have been 6 different pastors and priests who have helped to lead this church forward. And so there's bookshelves all around me that were contributed to by the previous 5 priests that served here. So we have quite a library, and I actually do read some of them and try to improve myself. But this week, as I was preparing for Lent 3, which we just observed on Sunday, I couldn't help but sort of pause and take a breath and say, you know what? These are some important details that we need to wrestle with. And coming from the Anglican Catholic perspective, we looked through a passage in Galatians and Ephesians. And Ephesians chapter 5 in particular sort of got my attention for the week that's coming up. And I looked at some of the passages for the prayer book, and we really talked about this moment where Paul goes to the church and he says, look, you're acting inappropriately. In other words, he gives them a sort of a warning about living in the light. This idea that we are called to be in the light and to leave the darkness behind. And if you wanted to follow along, you could find that in Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 1 through about 21. And in that passage, you'll see Paul is challenging the church of Ephesus and to us as the church of God widely to be careful how we live and to not be foolish, but to be wise and to take full advantage of the time that we've been given. And he goes into detail and he specifically mentions these 3 things that he was concerned about in the church. One was sexual immorality, 2 was impurity, and 3 was covetousness, or being covetous. Now, if you use those words sort of in the Old English, they really have less impact because they're old and they're sort of crusty words. So I wanted to break that down for us and understand the warning that Paul was giving us and recognize that it's a warning that we need to be very careful of. Number 1, sexual immorality. That's pretty straightforward. That could be called fornication. It could be called adultery. It would imply inappropriate sexual activity outside of the committed relationship of a marriage. It would also suggest the behavior of sexual lust, this idea that a man or a woman could be enticed by their thoughts or by the desire of their heart. And that could present itself in a variety of ways, from dating apps to books and movies and magazines to pornography that you could find online or anywhere else. The bottom line is that sexual immorality is a significant threat to the sanctity of marriage and to the purity of the sexual act as designed by God. And there's this sort of timelessness to it because Paul's writing those words over 2,000 years ago, and evidently it was a big deal then just as it is today. So sexual morality is the first thing that he considers walking in darkness. The second thing is all impurity, and he goes into detail about crude jokes and coarse jesting, and he sort of describes this sort of really inappropriate talk, this idea that in our downtime or when we're outside of the church, that our words and our language may be colored by inappropriate words. And I think what he's suggesting here is that there is a need for us to transition from the old self or the old habits of our life before the Holy Spirit and begin to shed ourselves of some of those impurities. The third thing that he mentions is covetousness, or the covetous issue of the heart. Now, greed is not covetousness. Greed is a constant and persistent demand for more, even though we may not have earned or deserve it. Greed is a systemic issue. Covetousness is much more specific and more subtle. Covetousness is when we pick one object or thing or person or goal, and we focus ourselves obsessively on that as our object of desire. So for a man, that might be a new Ford F-150, and for a woman, that might be the dream home she's always seen on TV but never lived in. We can make these things, these objects of our desire, really gods in the small g sense. These are the things in our life that we fill our obsessions and our emotions and our really lusts after. And that's really the point I'm trying to make, is that Paul is suggesting in this letter that when we walk in darkness, we're walking according to the lusts of the flesh. And, I've read some scholars on this idea of lust, and I, almost always think of lust as sexual, but I want you to expand your thinking to really a larger sphere, which is this idea that some theologians say lust is anything that we're unwilling to wait on. In other words, we lust after items that are non-sexual when we demand to have them now. And there's a behavior pattern that you see with impurity, sexual fornication, and covetousness, where we refuse to wait on God's timing for something, whether it's sex or a new home or a new car or a relationship, and we go ahead and take it for ourselves. And that sort of self-gratification, that idea of a lack of self-denial, the idea of us not being willing to say no to ourselves, is really, I think, the root of what Paul is suggesting in the text. And for me, that's incredibly convicting, because it doesn't matter if you're struggling with sexuality or you're struggling with just the fact that you're not quite content with where you're at. The bottom root level of the sin here is this fact that we don't trust God's timing. And we go ahead and accelerate his plan into function. And I think of guys like Abraham and Sarah, way back in the Old Testament in Genesis, where God had promised them a son, an heir, that would fulfill the Abrahamic covenant that God made with him. And they'd waited over 40 years and they didn't have a son, and so they decided to accelerate God's plan and help him out a little. And so they used their own resources to try and force the promise to occur. And in doing so, they created Ishmael. And Ishmael then becomes this sort of prototype of the flesh, this sort of reminder that when we don't wait on God, when we forge ourselves ahead, when we push ahead of his timing and his will and do it according to our timing and our logic, we get some really intense problems. And so Ishmael then becomes the son of the flesh that's talked about by Paul later as sort of this stereotype of the law and of the efforts of man to try and make himself better. Whereas Isaac then, the son of promise, would become this example of the Holy Spirit and how God really has the best plan. And so as you're thinking about these different ideas, the bottom line that really should come into focus for all of us is this idea that, as Paul has challenged us, the darkness of our life, the things that we used to do, those things that we lusted after, would have been things that we were unwilling to trust God for, and we would seize for our own satisfaction. And as Christians, as those who've had the deposit of the Holy Spirit placed within our hearts, we now have the capacity to shrug off the dark, to let go of our past, and then to press into the light. And this idea then is that as we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, right? This idea that if you want to be in the presence of God, if you want to be in communion, in intimacy with the Holy Spirit, then there has to be a persisting forward. This idea that I have not arrived yet, but I am moving in the right direction. And theologians and apologists all through the years have talked about things like sanctification and the idea of us having a new heart or a new spirit within us being the idea of regenerate or a regenerate spirit within us. Evangelicals, you would call that being born again. For the Anglican Catholics and others, they might call that partakers of the divine majesty. But what we're describing, in essence, is the same moment where we are justified by grace from the work of Christ on Calvary. And when we avail ourselves of his gift, when we receive that, and we submit ourselves to him as the Lord of our life, then we receive the deposit of that covenant as the Holy Spirit within us. And that can occur in infancy or it can occur in adulthood. But the bottom line is that it sparks in each and every believer's spirit and heart a transformation that begins a process that will not be completed until Christ's return in the new kingdom. Our lives then become a journey of transformation. Our lives become an ongoing, progressive struggle between what was the old self and the old man and the old ways, the darkness, and the new man and the new self and the new life, which is in the light. And this transformation of our will and our heart, our affections, our soul, our mind, everything is the ongoing battle of every Christian believer. And this is really where Paul is talking to the church. And he's saying to them, look, I want you to be aware that these struggles you're going through and these issues that keep plaguing you are common to the Christian life. And he would write about this in Romans, and he would say something to the effect of, I do what I don't want to do, and that which I wish I would do, I don't. In other words, there was a wrestling within Paul's spirit as an apostle between the things he knew he was supposed to do and those things that he wanted to do. That wrestling between the old and the new is really beautifully described in Jacob's wrestling with an angel one night in Genesis until he begs him to bless him and he's named Israel. And you see in that wrestling and in that sort of exhaustive struggle, you see that dynamic, right, between the good and the bad in every believer's life. After the service on Sunday, we had a coffee hour and some time of discussion. And one of the questions that came up repeatedly was this idea of, if I still struggle with sin, does that mean I'm not a Christian, or does that mean I haven't been saved? And my answer to you is this: if you're struggling with sin and it bothers you, that is evidence that you have the Holy Spirit within you. The conscience of God is pricking your conscience and saying, hey, I want you to lay that down. I want you to stop with that. I want you to pick this up. And so there is this ongoing battle in every believer's life. If you want some more information about that, just email me at frbradmathias@outlook.com. I'd be happy to send you some notes on that and some possible reading material if you're wanting to know more. But the bottom line is that for the Christian, whether they're evangelical, Anglican, or Catholic, there is a process that is occurring within your soul that began at the moment of your conversion, and it will not be completed until Christ's return. It is a process that all of us share, and it is a struggle that we all have to engage in if we're going to follow Jesus in this life. One of my favorite bands is Switchfoot. In 2009, they had a record called The Beautiful Letdown. One of my favorite songs from that record is called I Dare You to Move. And it goes like this, at least I'm quoting part of it. Between who you are and who you could be, between how it is and how it should be, I dare you to move. I dare you to lift yourself up off the floor. I dare you to move like today never happened. It's kind of a helpful reminder. You see, the enemy of our soul, Lucifer, is the accuser of the brethren, and he's had millennia to get good at this. And so when we do fail, and we will, when we fall and we fall short of God's holiness, when we recognize the sin that is in us, there's a temptation to surrender to the process and say, I'm never, ever going to be a good Christian. And I want to remind you that it's time to get up. It's time for you to get off the floor. And I dare you to move. I dare you to go forward with your life. I dare you to trust that Jesus' grace is greater than your sin. You see, that's the ultimate message of the gospel, and we as his ambassadors are portraying that every day. It's just not always in the way we think we're going to portray it. You see, it's in our forgiveness and redemption that God is glorified. And so I dare you to trust God with your deepest failures, with your most repeated offenses in your life. Because it's in those broken spaces and places of life that God's beautiful redemptive work can be most seen. It does take a persistent reminder, though. There is an effort, a struggle for our minds to remember the truth and to not dwell just on the negatives of our failures. And I believe that Sunday worship and Mass and regular Bible study and prayer, these are important sort of disciplines for the Christian. Without them, we lose faith, and we lose heart, and we don't persist. So if you're struggling, if you find yourself down on the floor and you just don't feel like you can get up again, you can, but it will take the grace of God to give you the desire to do what's right. So I hope this was helpful. Love you guys. May God's grace richly dwell in you, and I'll see you here in a few weeks.